Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 160 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Wesley Chu, author of the humorous sci-fi action novel The Lives of Tao. His new novel Time Salvager, about a time travel agency that scavenges resources from the past, is currently being adapted for film by Michael Bay. And now here's our interview with Wesley Chu. All right, so we're here with Wesley Chu. Welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Okay, so first of all, just tell us a bit about your background as a science fiction fan. Just how did you get into it?
I actually got into it through fantasy. So when I was as a little kid, my dad, who's an English professor, took me to like a bookstore, and he, told me, you could buy, or I will buy you whatever book you want. And at the time, he, basically as an English professor, he was like steering me towards like Shakespeare or like Beowulf or something like that. And instead, I ran towards all the books with the pretty pictures. Although actually, not the pretty pictures, but like the pretty, pictures of like manticores and like magic swords. So my very first two books were A Spell for Chameleon by Piers Anthony and The Misenchanted Sword by Lawrence Walt Evans. Yeah.
And also, I heard you say Robert Aspirin you read when you were a kid?
I read like the first 9 myth books. I read the first 18 Bazant books. I read all the L. Frank Baum books, all the Oz books. Did some Tim Powers a little bit later on. And I really didn't get into like regularly reading sci-fi until probably, a lot later, after college, when I started reading John Scalzi, Old Man's War. I think it was my very first post-2000 science fiction novel.
And so were you writing any fiction of your own? Like, when did you start writing your own fiction?
So I wrote my first short story in like second grade. I remember this very clearly because it's kind of like a turning point in my life. And it was actually a science fiction short story about like the solar system and all the planets used to run into each other and like, get pockmarks over their surfaces because they kept banging into each other. So they got in a bunch of fights. And then the son, who was the king, got pissed off at them for always like running to him, complaining about each other, so he enforced gravity upon them. And my English professor father read it and basically said, this doesn't suck. And that kind of started me off, like the planting of seeds of like maybe I want to write stories for a living. And then when I was 16, and back in the early 90s, career counseling was not a thing, or it wasn't a very good thing. So I didn't know what my options were. So I actually told my father, "Hey, Dad, I'm gonna be an English major just like you, and I'm gonna write books for a living." And then my dad basically said, "No, son, your life will suffer." So I didn't. I became a computer science major, and I say that I've been chasing that mistake ever since. But in reality, it's probably like a really, really smart decision to make.
Yeah. So were you writing anything at all during sort of college and the years after college?
I didn't. So what happened was, I worked, I was a computer science major. I worked in large financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, and stuff. But I was always looking for stuff to do, like that, like a calling. And I got away from writing for a while. So, I became a member of the Screen Actors Guild. I was acting. I was heavily into martial arts. I was getting really good at it. And then I think around like 26, 25, 26 or something like that, I realized that, I was working a day job. I was training 18, 20 hours a week. I had no friends. And I was kind of lost in searching. So I kind of dug deep a little into like, what used to make me happy. And then I remembered I used to love to write. Or I remember I loved reading. So that's when I basically dropped everything. I dropped all my martial arts, most of the acting I was doing. I went straight into writing. I wrote a terrible first novel. It was like a 180K monstrosity. It didn't go anywhere. It was probably the most important book I ever wrote because I learned all my, valuable lessons of what not to do for a book. I got drunk for a week, and then I started Lives of Tao.
Well, so what were some of the lessons you learned from writing that monstrosity novel?
I mean, it was 180,000 words, but it wasn't epic fantasy. It was like I think it was like 2 points of view. So it was 2 points of view at 180K. It was self-indulgent. I think I had fart jokes in there. It was just really badly written. I think because a lot of my early, I read Wheel of Time. You know, I was one of those guys that waited in line for the Wheel of Time, and I read all the Dragonlance books. So I think in that novel I had a lot of walking. Like my dudes walked around a lot. They walked around a lot. They told fart jokes. They got drunk at taverns. It was basically like Dragonlance fan fiction without the cool dragons.
Okay, and so you mentioned Lives of Tao, which went on to be your first published novel. What was sort of the genesis of that project?
So I have a thing where I dream my plots, and the thing about Lives of Tao is it kind of started one day when my alarm clock rang like really early in the morning, and I had this idea planted that, you know, what if that alarm clock was like a personal trainer that was an alien in my head of talking to me, trying to like make me get up. And then from that point, it kind of morphed into Roland Tan, my main character in Lives of Tao. He's kind of like an older, like, no, not older, but he's not a young man or teenager, but he's in his early 30s, and he's kind of lost with his life. You know, he's had many opportunities to succeed in life, but he's never taken advantage of them. And he hates his job and has very low self-esteem and can't talk to girls. So he's got all these things that are pent up inside. And that's kind of where I was at with my career as well. So I didn't like my job. I wanted to do something else, but I didn't know how to do it. I didn't have the confidence to like take a risk. So I came up with the idea of like, you know, the Lives of Tao having these ancient aliens who can communicate with you but can't control you. So even though they're wise and they can, you know, really guide you towards your goals, at the end of the day, the host or Rowan or whoever it is has to actually do it himself. He has to want to make that change and has to, you know, work towards realizing what his goals are. So and that kind of paralleled where I was at, you know, in my mid-20s.
Right. And so when you started that book, did you know that this was going to be your first published book, or did you have any idea of that?
I mean, yes and no, because back then when you don't know better, every book you're working on feels like it's going to be your first breakout hit. And, you know, so I was very confident about that. And the book definitely, the first draft definitely wasn't ready. I went through a very small round of submissions and it totally just got slammed. And then I quit writing for 3 years and I played World of Warcraft because that's what you do. World of Warcraft came out and that became like my life for the next 3 years. I was a raid leader and a guild officer and all that good stuff. So I did that, and then after, you know, 3 years of getting burned out on Warcraft, I got back to writing again, and then I, you know, dug up the Lives of Tao. By that time, I was a little bit more mature, a little bit, you know, more knowledgeable about the industry. I brushed it up. I did a pretty thorough edit, and then Angry Robot in March 2011 had a 1-month open submission. So I submitted to them. And I think in that 1 month they had 955 submissions. Out of those 955, I think, you know, they asked for 65 full manuscripts. Out of those 65 manuscripts, 25 made it to acquisitions, and out of those 25, 5 books got picked up, got contracts, and that was one of those 5.
Wow. So you never had an agent at all up to this point?
I think in the editorial phase when they had 25 books, they asked for 25 books, I signed up my agent, Russ Galen.
Okay, wow, great. And so then tell us a bit about writing the book. Like, what was your process for writing it from the point at which you you picked it up? Like, you were working a full-time job, right? Like, how much time per day did you spend working on it and stuff like that?
So back then I was pretty much a pantser, and I like schedules. So my routine every day was I go to my job right till 5, 6 o'clock. Then I go to the gym for like 2 hours, and then from 8 to whenever the cafe closed, I would write and play poker and eat dinner at the same time. It's kind of like my thing, because when you first start writing, you don't have the stamina, the mental stamina to sit in one place. and just write for hours on end. So I was trying to do a couple things at once to keep my ass in a chair. The problem with that is your attention's always all over the place. So all that meant was I ended up having really, really bad plotting and grammar, and I lost a whole bunch of money playing online poker. But at the end of the day, I got that rough draft done, and over time, I was able to train myself to write and sit and focus on writing for longer periods of time. So eventually, the poker fell aside. By the way, it's a really bad way to train yourself. Don't ever do that.
So what would you recommend instead then? Just the same thing without the poker, or?
I think I don't know how people do it now. I mean, for a long time, that was my weekday routine, and then for my weekends, I would basically be one of those dudes who went to different cafes every weekend. I'd pick a different cafe. I'd go there for 4 or 5 hours, and I would write. And I'd abuse the bottomless cup of coffee policy, and I'd be that creepy dude in the corner who's just banging away at a laptop for hours on end. I think these days, if somebody, a new writer would ask me that question, I would probably tell them, hey, write in set spurts, take many breaks, but when you do write, really focus on writing, and when you're not writing, when you're taking that break, really don't think about writing and do something else for a while, and eventually you'll naturally have a rhythm to when you sit down and get words on the screen.
Yeah. Okay, so this first novel comes out from Angry Robot. What was that experience like, and what sort of responses did you get to the book?
I mean, it's kind of like losing your virginity, but kind of better, because honestly, losing your virginity is over. It's okay, but getting your first book out, seeing it on the bookshelf. I actually had a pretty big release party, so at the time I still had a pretty decent job. I was still working a job, so I'm like, look, I'll never debut ever again. And, a debut actually means something to me. So my brother surprised me. He flew in from LA to surprise me. I rented out a rooftop lounge in downtown Chicago. I think I catered a bunch of sushi, and I basically blew half my advance on the stupid party. But you know what? I had 250 people come, and it was fantastic.
And then how about responses to the book? What sort of reviews or reader reactions did you get?
You know what? I by the time the book came out, Angry Robot is a mid-sized publisher, I was confident that it was going to do decent. I thought it was a fun spa book, and I just wanted to get that first book out. And to be honest, the response has been really overwhelming. It did really well the first couple of weeks, and it continued to grow. Even now, I'm on book tour right now for Time Salvager, and every bookstore I stop by, they keep telling me your book is a very regular seller. It's big, it's yellow, it's easy to sell, and a lot of people like it. So I'm hoping that it's one of those books that 5-10 years from now it'll still be on bookshelves.
So that's the secret. Big yellow books is the way to succeed with it.
I'm not going to lie. Okay, when every writer, when they think about their first book or when they see the cover art, we dream about art. We dream about having just this beautiful artistic painting or scene for a book cover. And when I first saw Lives of Tao, I was like, oh, that's really interesting, but it's not art. But if I walk 20 feet away from the book and look at it, I can see it. If I put that book on a bookshelf filled with beautiful books, that have art, it stands out. So the point of a book cover is to attract the eye and sell you books, and it does a fantastic job. I think Angry Robot just hit it out of the park when it came to the cover design.
That's awesome. So, okay, so I know you wrote 2 sequels to The Lives of Tao, and then you mentioned you wrote Time Salvager. What was the order in which you wrote those books, or in which they were released?
Okay, so let's see. Lives of Tao came out early May 2013. Angry Robot pushed The Deaths of Tao from 2014 to November 2013. But so after Deaths of Tao came out, I wrote Time Salvager before Rebirth of Tao. Rebirth of Tao came out April 2015, and Time Salvager came out July 7th, 2015. So Rebirth of Tao is my last book that I wrote.
Okay, well, so tell us about the inception of Time Salvager. How'd that idea come about?
Okay, so Time Salvager is one of, like, I usually don't like talking about like what inspired you to write this book, but Time Salvager is one of those few that I really enjoy the story. So I read an article about a South African photojournalist named Kevin Carter. So he was taking pictures, or he's a photojournalist in Sudan covering the famine there, and he took a really iconic picture of this kid crawling towards an aid station, and there's a vulture hopping behind him, like waiting for him to die. And he took the picture. Kevin thought that it wasn't his job to interfere, so he left the kid. He won a Pulitzer for that picture, and then he committed suicide 11 months later. I know that story kind of like really stuck with me, and a few weeks later, I had a dream that I was a time traveler going to the Titanic. To steal the Hope Diamond, because that's what you do when you're on Titanic. You steal the Hope Diamond. And I didn't know where the diamond was, so I spent, most of the dream befriending the crew and the passengers trying to find a diamond, knowing full well that all these people were going to die. But it wasn't my job to interfere. My job was to get the Hope Diamond. So right when the ship started sinking, that's when I hopped back. That's when I woke up. And I actually don't know if I actually got the Hope Diamond, but when I woke up, I was thinking to myself, that's a really good way to use time travel. It's, the number one rule for time travel should be you don't change the present if you change the timeline. But if you jump to moments before disaster, you can salvage. You can basically cover your tracks. And the problem with this job, though, is you experience the last terrible moments of all the victims, and you can't do anything about it. Time Salvager is a time travel book, but really it's also about, PTSD and the effects of depression and leaving, and like knowing that you're leaving people to die, and how does that affect you over time?
Yeah. Well, say a bit more specifically about the setting you came up with, because it's you have this character James Griffin Bars, and it's set hundreds of years in the future. Tell us about that kind of stuff.
Well, so I'm a high concept guy, so I came up with the idea of Time Salvager and these Kron men and how they go back in time to farm resources from the past. And then from that, I moved to my characters who, James is one of these Kron men, and how does doing that job affect his psyche, and, how does he deal with it? In his case, he lost his sister a few years earlier. He drinks a lot. He's kind of suicidal. He's, kind of a little bit, he's losing it. And then I think about, what is his foil, what is his salvation, who are the characters involved, and in that case, I actually created Grace Priestley first, the Mother of Time, and then I created Elise Kim. And then, like, once I get the characters, that's when I start world building. Is okay, so we have this technology, we have these time travelers to go back in time to farm for resources. Why do they need to do that? What is the situation, in this universe that requires them to find these resources? Well, obviously, it's a resource scarce, environment. So what has happened? And from there, I slowly start, creating this backstory about how, humanity has colonized the solar system, and we've had a moment of prosperity, but we lost it, and we lost it because of, of war, of environmental catastrophes, of squandering resources, of out of control capitalism. So it's all these things I slowly add as I kind of move, spread the world building out.
Right. So in this book, you have hundreds of years of future history, and often when James jumps back in time, he's jumping back to a time period that's the future from our point of view. How much of that future did you work out in advance, and how much of it did you develop after you started actually composing the text of the book?
I think most of it I worked out in advance. I wanted to use those time traveling scenes as a way of storytelling, about filling in the background of that world without doing too much telling. So this is my way of showing you, like, okay, so this is what happened, and if you really take a step back and look at the story from like a 10,000 feet up view, you can actually chronologically figure out how the wars happened, what happened within the universe. Like this, they were prospering. This war happened. This war caused this to happen. This caused these people to do this. So you can actually map everything out, and a lot of it, I would say the most of it was planned out in advance.
Well, say a bit more about like some of the because you have some pretty cool things. You have the AI wars and the gas wars and the Publai age. Just say a bit about what some of these future developments are in your book.
So, the AI wars, we've always talked about how AI is having these uprisings and how they take over humanity with the whole Skynet Terminator thing. And I wanted to show that a little bit, but not so much to talk about that war, but the after effects of that war, where because we should have good AI in the future. However, why don't we? And part of that is because we had an AI war, and from that, humanity had recovered to an extent, but they strictly limit artificial intelligence because of that. But on top of that, they also create these different societies that that were left over. That basically they were the refugees from these wars, and how they had kind of splintered from most of humanity. Where like the Publai age is about these people who broke off from the rest of society, and they had these very strictly controlled, these environments or these cities, these floating cities and generation ships that basically can read your mind, so that they want you to be controlled because they were a reflex of previous wars. And the gas wars and some of those were basically how capitalism, how these large conglomerate companies are fighting over scarce resources out of the solar system. There's another war called the Core War, where the planets from Mars and in were fighting all the outer rim planets over resources and control of the solar system. So, there's a very distinct storyline that happens that kind of maps out what happened to humanity in that time frame.
Right. And you mentioned the character Dr. Grace Priestley, who was like one of my favorite characters in the book. Say a bit more about her.
I think she's everybody's favorite character. Actually, I love it. But she was probably like the very first character in the story right after James, and I just really wanted to show how foreign her society could be, yet how human she is. I mean, she's a very strong human. She's a genius, and she really likes sex, and she's old. And she's in control, and she's strong, but she's also very vulnerable in many ways. So I don't know, she's just a really fun character to write. I came up with her pretty organically, and I knew I wanted her to be the leader of a very high technologically advanced civilization, but then I wanted her to show some very base instincts as well.
Yeah, well, and she also invented the laws of time travel in this world. Tell us about that.
So Grace initially invented the time travel to kind of aid her civilization. Now, she is the leader of the technology isolationists. They're a very advanced, splinter group of humanity, but they don't have a lot of resources. So, and they're fighting against the Neptune divinities, which is basically like religious fanatics who were incredibly large, but didn't have a lot of technology, and they were being overwhelmed. So their lack of resources, no matter how advanced they were fully killing them. So she was inventing time travel to help to farm these resources, to help her the TIs against the war. However, she also recognized, being the genius, she recognized that time travel is an extremely dangerous tool. So she wanted to create these time laws in order to lay down some ground rules on what you can and can't do. Right.
And so what are the dangers of time travel exactly? I mean, if someone goes into the past and they change something major in your view of time travel, what's going to happen?
That was one of the big things that one of the first rules I had when I wrote this book is I wanted it to be very clear that time traveling is not here to change the future or change the present. And then one example I always use is the whole Hitler thing, where you can use time. Well, what does everybody say when they talk about time travel? What do you do with time traveling? You either A, kill Hitler, prevent Yoko Ono from picking up the Beatles, make a lot of money. That's stuff people do. How do I win? How do I bet on the World Series? And the thing about it is, let's say you do kill Hitler. Let's say we go some time travel. Somebody invents time travel, goes back and offs young Adolf as he's coming out of watercoloring class. Now, and most likely, the Third Reich's still going to happen. Hitler isn't the only reason the Third Reich happened. So there's a good chance that even though you kill Hitler, we're still going to get a Nazi party. And for all we know, the new Führer, or the leader of the party, read a little Napoleonic history. Maybe he looked at the map of Europe and Russia and goes, that's a lot of land to cover. I don't think it's a good idea for us to head east. Let's just put our attention on Europe and the UK. So, and before you know it, we are 70 years into the 1,000-year Reich. So there's a lot of dangers involved with changing the timeline. So in Time Salvager, there's an agency called Chronicom. Their job is to farm these resources, but one of their main jobs also is to prevent the timeline from being changed. So if they ever have one of their guys go back in time and make a mistake or somehow intentionally cause what they call a ripple, they actually send guys to course correct the error so that the timeline basically stays the same.
Right, because they would all cease to exist, right? If a big enough change were allowed to perpetuate itself through the timeline.
Yeah, there's a way I deal with the timeline where they can see the ripple happening. So if somebody makes a change, early on in the past, these guys in the future who are always monitoring this can see the ripple that's occurring, and that ripple is basically what's slowly changing the timeline. So they can actually act ahead and course correct.
Yeah. And so they have these guys called auditors whose job is to clean up messes made by the Kronmen.
Yes.
And all these guys have just amazing technology at their disposal. So tell us about the exos, which are really, really cool. They're sort of these kind of bracelets that you wear, I guess. I mean, how did you come up with the whole idea for the exos and the bands?
I was trying to think of like how would these guys be able to go back in time and utilize certain powers without being so high tech. And that's just kind of what I came up with. I thought I wanted to give them limitations on what they can do, yet I wanted to make the technology adaptable, so that when they go back in time, they can still utilize it without, looking like they're like Terminator 2 for the future. So, and I also wanted to show that even though humanity is slowly suffocating in the future, they're still able to invent, incredible things. So it's kind of like a dichotomy of like, on one hand, there's people starving, and they're savages, they're wastelanders and tribes out in the radioactive lands, and then there's still really, really advanced technology. Because at the end of the day, if you think about even in modern society, we're always advancing military tech, even while like bad things are happening all around us. Even though we could be spending that money, curing cancer or like feeding the poor, but we're always spending a lot of money advancing our military technology, and that's kind of true in the future as well.
Right. Yeah, and so these exos, they have kind of a force field that makes them more or less invulnerable, and they have kind of energy whips / energy spears, and they can also alter their appearance in pretty much any way that they want. So they have this enormous power. So how did you balance that? Like, what kind of limitation did you struggle at all with? What sort of limitations to put on those powers, or what was your approach to that?
So here's what happens: is these Kronmen and auditors, they all wear several bands. The one that lets them change their appearance is called a paint band, and what that is, they actually have to very methodically record the thing they're copying. And it takes them, and they can't record it on the fly. They actually have to really download the entire every nuance of whatever they're painting over before they can use it. Now, there's a band that allows them to protect them from radiation. There's a band that allows them to communicate in different languages. There's a band that the monitors, the regular soldiers use, that are basically firing like laser beams. And then the actual exo bands are the ones that the auditors and the Kronmen use. And if you look at how they're described, like auditors and Kronmen use different kinds of bands. So auditor bands are much more powerful than Kronmen bands, but they're also a lot more inefficient. Kronmen bands, these guys can go back in time. They can survive for days or weeks in history as they do their jobs, and these bands are a lot more more energy efficient than the auditor bands. There are other bands like the ones that the corporations use, who were made to fight in space. So instead of creating, being able to create half a dozen coils, they create one much more powerful coil. But in doing so, it affects the way they have to anchor themselves when they fight sometimes. So there's a lot of different kinds of combat bands, and they all have weaknesses and strengths, and are used for different things.
And so you mentioned like that these different kinds of weapons, have different strengths and weaknesses when they fight each other, and there are just some like out of control fight scenes in this book. Tell us about your approach to writing those. I mean, do you act them out, or do you like sketch them out, or do you like perform them with action figures, or I don't know, what is your approach to those fight scenes?
I used to act them out. I think that in the Lives of Tao, I think that the first iterations of the Lives of Tao, I could reenact every single fight scene. I mean, I come from a martial art background, and I was very proud of the fact that, hey, look, this scene can actually happen. And then I realized that, you know what, this scene can actually happen, but it reads kind of boring. Because, that's, being authentic in your fight scene isn't as important as, what the fight scene's there for. Now, fight scene is a conversation with fists. A fight scene is about tension, climax, and the result. So that's kind of my philosophy of fight scenes. I don't reenact them out. I don't act them out anymore. I try to keep them entertaining, interesting, and a little different each time. I hope I succeed. I don't know if I do. But with Time Salvager, I just hope I'm showing something a little bit different that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, do you work out what's going to happen in the fight ahead of time, or do you just write your way through it?
I write my way through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no science to my stink there. just kind of muck through it, and then after I get the scene out, I'll probably take a day off and I'll read it and decide that if it's too much, it's too little, does it make any sense, and if it doesn't, on any of those levels, I course correct.
Right. And so I heard you say that you sort of wrote, I think, the first couple of chapters of this, and then kind of figured out what the story was going to be. How did you find what was the process of sort of writing, the beginning of the book?
So once I used to be a complete pantser, and I was those guys that would just write without an outline. And then over time, I became more hooked on like really staying with an outline. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to do a hybrid form of writing where, I will write the first probably 3 to 6 chapters, just kind of getting the feel for the character, getting the feel for the world, kind of sharing the narrative in my head. And then once I get that down, then I start outlining. And then I'll write a very thorough outline. The problem with almost every single one of my outlines is they jump the shark at like certain points. Always at the 70% mark, I just completely jump the rails. Many times between like 30 to 40%, I kind of like jump the rails too. So what I'm doing now is I only outline a third at a time. So I would pants the first couple chapters, then I would go back and revise. I get the feel of everything. Then I write a very thorough outline up to a third, and then I write it out. And then I re-outline, do some course correction. Then I write it out again, and so on, so on, so on.
Right, because I think I heard you say that you had written the first couple chapters of the book, and you didn't know where it was going to go, and you were considering giving up writing or something. Like, talk about that period of the book.
Oh, no. So what happened was Time Salvager sold off a partial. A partial is not a full manuscript. And at the time, I had a very clear vision of, the setting, but I wasn't sure how to end the story. And it's a weird thing because when you sell off a full manuscript, the editor who buys it, they like, or at least pretty much like what they see. There's a weird pressure involved with selling off a partial because you want to give them a good book, but they don't know how you're going to end it, and many times the author doesn't know either. So it was just a really weird stress attached to that. I've never had to deal with that before until I sold the partial, where writers were already kind of neurotic people anyway. This is just additional stress that I wasn't prepared for. So I think at one point when the contract first came in, I was like, oh, if I don't sign it, then I don't have to finish the book, which is a terrible, terrible career decision to make. So always finish your book.
So you initially conceived this as a standalone book, and then it kind of grew into more than that?
Right. So here's the thing is, after I mapped out the first book, I realized that, look, this is a big problem that requires big solutions. And it just didn't make sense for me to try to solve everything in one. It was impossible to solve everything in one book. So that's when I, kind of took a step back, reimagined everything, the characters and everything that was going on, and realized that this story has, I wouldn't call it a space opera, because it's actually in space, but it's definitely more of a more epic in scope. And that's when I remapped it out to a 3-book series.
Right, and you've already finished the second book, right?
Yes. The second book is coming out early May 2016. I believe the tentative date is May 7th, but I don't think that's locked in yet.
And then what's the status of the third book? Have you started writing that yet, or how's that going?
I am taking a break. So right now, Time Salvager is my 4th published book, and Time Salvager 2 is my 5th book. The 5th book that I wrote. And that's 2 trilogies that I've worked on in a span of, 2-3 years. So I decided to take the summer off, and I'm writing 2 partials that are standalones. And then I think in a few months, I'll sit with my agent and my editor, and we'll see where we're at with the third book. But right now, I'm reveling in not thinking about trilogies right now.
Is there anything you can say about those partials you're working on?
Right now, their titles are The Recovered and A Pet Named Charles. And The Pet Named Charles is an idea I conceived when I was doing Kilimanjaro back in February. And it's about my dog, except it's not about my dog.
Is it YA?
No, it's not a YA. It's about eugenics. So no, not a YA.
Oh, sounds good. Actually, speaking of titles, I saw in a couple interviews you said that Time Salvager was not definitely going to be the title of this book until it came out. I mean, what other titles were you considering? What was the factors that went into titling this book?
Time Salvager was the original name I had for this from the get-go. My editor and I at Tor, we played around with some other options, and at the end of the day, we settled back on Time Salvager. We're about to settle on the title of the second book, and it's probably going to be Time Siege. So, titles are hard, man. When Angry Robot first bought the Lives of Tao, my editor there was like, I could see the Lives of Tao as a really good name for the series, but not for a book. So we spent 3 months just going back and forth, going through picking all these names, and I had a list of 150 really terrible names. At the very end, he sends me an email, and he's like, "Got the title for the book for you. What do you think about the Lives of Tao?" And I'm like, "All right, good."
Okay, and so I heard that this book was optioned for film, and that Michael Bay is attached. Can you say anything about that?
That's a no comment. That's all I can say about that.
Okay, because I think I saw you announced it on your blog, and then you deleted the post later on. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a no comment.
Do you want me to just edit that out?
I mean, you could. No comment's a completely legitimate answer.
Okay. Do you has there been any film or TV interest in any of your other books?
So, a screenwriter that has has done movies in Hollywood is interested in the Lives of Tao, and currently we have a 30-minute pilot for it. So I'm not sure where we're at, but I've read the pilot, and it's really damn good.
And can you say, I mean, is it very similar to the book, or have they like tweaked it in some major ways, or?
I think I would say he's pretty accurate. I mean, he's really kept the spirit of the book. Some of the scenes were moved around. He has, kind of accelerated, some of the conflict, which is great. So, but I think overall, definitely the spirit of the story is there, and that's really what's the most important.
Huh. Cool. I saw actually this book. It's dedicated. The Time Salvager is dedicated to your grandparents, and there's this acknowledgments page at the beginning about them. Could you just talk about why you included that in the book?
So, as I was writing Time Salvager, it kind of got me thinking about like how I grew up, and like I came to the U.S. when I was 5 years old, and I came because my father was studying, English at the time at University of Nebraska. My grandparents, raised me, and then it just kind of occurred to me, like, there were 100 small decisions that could have been made that would have kept me there in Taiwan. And life would have been great in Taiwan, I'm sure, but there were so many things that could have been done, that could have happened in my, really brief history, in my brief past, that could have steered me away from writing. I love what I do. This is what I was meant to do. I am a single-purpose machine. All I am here to do on this world is to write books. And it might have not happened just if my, grandparents decided that I should stay in Taiwan, or my dad decided that he didn't want to, study English in the States, or, my mom decided not to go with him to Nebraska. So there's all these small things that could have happened that would have just changed everything for me. And I just kind of, writing Time Salvagers kind of got me thinking about all these things, and really how appreciative I am of all the sacrifices they all made so that I am sitting here right now, with my 4th book published.
I heard you say that your dad will still call you sometimes and say, like, hey, I have a lead on a job at a bank if you want to change jobs.
Yeah, my dad is my biggest fan. He's my biggest fan. But he also knows how tough being a writer is, and how hard it is to make a living in the industry. So up until January, I would say, no, not January. I'd say up until like probably April, he would sometimes like email me like, hey, I got you an interview at Chase Bank, son, or or he'd be like, say, I know somebody who is a headhunter who may help you find a job. So it took both my parents quite a while to accept that this is my full-time job, and I'm not going back to a cubicle ever again. I am officially unemployable from this point on by any major corporation. So this is it. This is my end game.
Right, because I also heard you say it was something similar with your wife, right, where she gave you sort of 2 years to prove that you could make a living at this.
Yeah, so what happened was, I was working at a large bank for a long time, and common practical advice, for authors is if you can handle a day job and write books at the same time, that's what you do. You work that day job until you can't anymore. You work that day job until you're just so damn busy that something's got to give. That's when you go full time. In my case, January 2014, I got laid off. And it was kind of expected, but, personally, I thought I had another year left to kind of like do both, but we were ready for it. And by then, I was already focusing on writing more than I was on day jobbing, I guess. So my wife, we talked about it, and it was actually, and she agreed. She goes, look, it's a big pay cut for the family, so we will sacrifice, and you have 2 years to make something of yourself. And if you can't, then start applying for jobs. And I think that was, that 2 years is, that was my window. So I'm very appreciative of her support, and that's when I got cracking on writing books.
And then how close did you cut it in the 2 years? Like, did you achieve your goal like in a year and a half, or like 20 months, or what was it?
I mean, we didn't have like exact metrics, you know. She wasn't like, here's your graph up. Once you hit the blue line, you have passed and leveled up. So, it was kind of like an arbitrary thing where like, you know, work hard, let's see what we can get out, and if we're still struggling after X amount of time, go find a job. And I think she officially allowed me to pass and level up back in May of this year. So I am, for better or worse, I am full-time writing now.
Yeah.
Forever.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, I mean, as I said, I really enjoyed Time Salvager, so I'm glad that you're writing full-time because I'm looking forward to seeing more books like this. And so, yes, I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Wesley Chu, and this new book is called Time Salvager. It's a blast. I really recommend it. And so, Wes, thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Wesley Chu for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Ricky Granger in the US and Tony Nick 1 in the UK. And of course, a special thank you to Slater Davidson, Suzanne K. Moses, and Bob J. 50,000, who all just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. I'd also like to thank Sebastian Henselt and Damian Dimmick, who both increased their pledge amounts this week. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd prefer to make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I'd like to thank Rory Carroll and Evangelina Crozer, who just became PayPal patrons number 117 and 118. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.